want to begin today with a personal confession. My biggest fear in life had always been death. I'm talking about death today. The idea of not existing, of ceasing to be, used to weigh heavily on me. I did not experience much death as a child, unlike many in my profession who were surrounded by it, whether due to personal loss at a young age or by being a family member of a funeral director or a cemeterian, where death was commonplace and talked over the dining room table. A lot of folks and friends and colleagues who lived in a funeral home, and that's all they ever experienced. I was none of that. No, for me, I did not lose any close friends or family members until my 20s. I was pretty darn lucky. When I was little, we would visit the cemetery periodically, often around major holidays, leave flowers for relatives I never knew. My family didn't speak all that much about them, and to me, they were just names etched in stone. Not quite real, not quite gone. Back then, I wasn't afraid. Death was something distant, tidy, contained within those fences of the cemeteries. But somewhere along the way, that distance faded. I'm trying to recollect before putting this sermon together on a single point or single moment or experience that planted that fear of death in me. It just seemed one day to appear. And looking back, it's hard to remember a time when it wasn't there. I said I couldn't remember that turning point. Maybe that's because, in a way, it's always with us. That awareness that each day we're inching closer to whatever comes next while moving back towards what came before. Now, I'm not a theologian by any means, even though I went and got my degree in divinity, but I can certainly spiral into deep thoughts about death and existence, like many of them. But I promise I will try to keep this a hopeful reflection as well. Hard when it's talking about death, but so we'll get there. And so, how did I deal with my fear of death? I decided to face it head on, like I do in many things in life. I jumped into the death care profession, working in cemeteries, working with families, surrounding myself with the reality of mortality every single day. But even while doing that work, I found myself wrestling with the same questions that many of us likely carry. What does death mean? Is there something after? How do I make sense of it all, either within or outside of religion? What I didn't expect was for a television show to so profoundly speak to those very questions I had been quietly seeking answers to. I talked to another congregation member just before this, and they were saying that they weren't expecting this from the show either. So I instantly admired the work of filmmaker Mike Flanagan for his way of weaving horror with humanity, of asking spiritual questions in unexpected ways. If you don't know him, he's most famous for The Haunting of Hill House that premiered on Netflix back in 2018. He followed that with a second chapter on The Haunting of Bly Manor, and he's got a third installment coming. He also directed a show called The Midnight Club, new adaptation of The Fall of House of Usher, along with many other horror works. They're all good, but my favorite. In my opinion, his best work to date came out into 2021 with the series Midnight Mass. You heard the soliloquy from as the reading. I remember binge watching it, expecting suspense, scares. What I didn't expect was to find one of the most profound explorations on death and meaning I have ever encountered. If you haven't seen the show, I'll give you a brief synopsis without giving too much away. Midnight Mass takes place on a small, isolated island community where faith and doubt live side by side. When a charismatic new priest arrives, the townspeople begin to experience what seems to be miracles, miraculous events, healings, renewed hope, and a powerful sense of spiritual awakening. But as the story unfolds, it becomes clear quickly that those miracles come at great costs to everyone on the island. The very end of the series, one of the main characters faces her death and speaks that soliloquy we heard earlier. The first time I heard those words, they absolutely wrecked me, but they also healed me. I remember sitting on the couch, my husband can attest to this, crying for over an hour because that monologue, that soliloquy, put into words something I had been struggling to realize for so long, that we are not as separate as we think. that death is not the end of everything, but a return, that our very atoms are stardust, part of something vast and eternal. Hearing that for the first time felt like something reached into my own wrestling with faith and gave me a compass. Didn't give me easy answers, but it gave me a path forward, path to kind of embrace and figure out what I believed and what I thought about death and life. And in many ways, that monologue echoes truths that UUs have always held close. We are part of an interconnected web of existence, that we belong to nature, and that the boundaries between life and death are not as sharp as we imagine. Just as that character remembered she was a drop of water returning to the ocean, our tradition reminds us too that we are part of a larger cycle of nature. We come from the earth and we return to the earth. We belong to the great flow of life that connects all beings across time, across galaxies, across space. And so today, I want to talk about death, not as a final wall we run into, but as part of the natural rhythm of life. I want to explore how impermanence, far from being a curse, can actually be a gift. Reminder to live fully, to love deeply, and to see beauty in what does not last. So, I started by sharing my greatest fear with you. And if we're honest, many of us probably share that fear here in the room, even if we don't name it aloud. Death unsettles us because it feels like the end of me, the end of self. Who am I if not my memories, my choices, my name? It's natural to resist that uncertainty. Our very biology is wired to survive, to keep the heart beating and the breath steady. And yet, fear of death is not a flaw in our humanity. It's part of it. Evolutionary biology tells us that awareness and avoidance of death helped humans survive in dangerous situations and environments. That instinct to sense danger and to preserve ourselves is written into our very bones. But unlike other creatures, we don't just avoid death. We analyze it, we wrestle with it, we theorize about it, right? The fox flees the hunter and moves on. That's it for animals, right? We flee, we write poems, we build rituals in churches, we construct entire philosophies around what it means to have fled. Our minds make meaning where our bodies once only moved. Poet Emily Dickinson called this cycle a circuit, the turning of seed to summer to tomb. And she asked, who's doomed to whom? Reminding us that death and life are not enemies, but partners in the same dance. But the Midnight Mass soliloquy offers a slightly different lens. It suggests that self is not as solid as we imagine, that what we call me is really a constellation of energy, molecules, and experiences, temporary arrangements of matter that were here long before us and will be here long after us. This vision is not so far from what science tells us, nor from what spirituality has long discerned, that we are part of something vast. Every atom in our bodies was forged in those stars, as she said. We are made of stardust. We are not sealed off separate beings, but interconnected expressions of one great web. Hope that sounds familiar. Our UU tradition names this in our 7th principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of to which we are a part. It's a reminder that death is not a solitary event. It's a return to the larger whole. My family only started coming to this church in January, and before that, we had very little exposure to Unitarian Universalism. I was raised as a Lutheran, baptized a Catholic, my husband was a Methodist, knew nothing about UUs prior. I did attend Harvard Divinity School, which, if you don't know, is a UU haven. Like, majority of students are UUs, and I didn't know it, didn't learn anything about it then. But all we've learned is basically been since January. So I remember looking at UUs and seeing that 7th principle, and it really struck me. It resonated deeply and reflected not only on what I believe about life and death, but also the sense of connection and belonging I've been searching for. And yet, even with that, we forget. We get caught up in the busyness of life, in the fear of endings, in the clinging to what feels permanent, which is why we need moments, stories, rituals, and seasons to help us remember. And this season, my favorite, the one we are in right now, is one of those reminders. Autumn itself is nature's sermon about impermanence. The trees blaze with colors, only to let go of their leaves, as we heard about Fletcher. The air cools, the light shifts, harvests come to an end. Death is everywhere around us in the natural world. And I don't typically hear people say the fall and autumn is frightening. They say it's beautiful, right? Now it is frightening to think about the cold that's coming, but we'll let that go. And notice how many traditions mark this season by remembering the dead. Halloween, which began as a Celtic New Year, when the veil between worlds was thought to be thin. All Saints and All Souls Days in the Christian traditions, honoring the departed faithful. Dia de los Muertos in Mexican tradition, with altars filled with marigolds, candles, food, photographs, to welcome ancestors home for one night. These rituals remind us the dead are not gone. They are with us. The boundary between life and death is porous. We are connected across time and space in ways we cannot fully see. For me, personally, being immersed in death through my work has helped me confront and to some extent overcome my own fear. I won't go into the full history here, but our cultural distancing from death over the last 150 years or so, and the rise of the funeral industrial complex, if you talk to me enough, you'll hear me say that a lot. The way we've pushed death into hospitals, mortuaries, hasn't helped us. If anything, it's made it harder to understand the natural, interconnected cycle between life and death. And as an aside, if anyone wants to talk about the evolution of the death care industry, I could talk hours on it. My husband can attest. He's been around for that. One personal moment that has stayed with me was when my grandmother, who was like another mother to me, passed away on Halloween night, going to be 3 years ago, in a couple weeks. There was a strange, comforting symmetry in that. She passed when, according to tradition, the veil between worlds is at the thinnest. It felt like she returned home in a season that has always reminded me that the boundaries between life and death are not as fixed as we think. That's why remembrance rituals, events, and other ways of bringing death into focus outside of just funerals, memorial services are so important. They help us grapple with mortality. They restore a sense of connection and meaning. One of my personal passions in the death care industry is programming and community engagement. Getting people back into the cemeteries for activities beyond just mourning. Walking tours that tell people of those interred, movie nights under the stars, workshops, even those seasonal celebrations like Dia de los Muertos and other events. All of these normalize our encounters with death and allow us to see cemeteries as spaces of life, memory, and shared history. These experiences echo the wisdom in the rituals we see this time of year. They remind us to speak our ancestors' name, tell their stories, light candles, and to remember, because remembering keeps that web of life and death alive. If we allow it, impermanence can be one of our greatest teachers. Think of autumn again. The falling leaves do not signal failure. They make room for winter's rest and spring renewal. In cemeteries, I've seen the same truth, how grief can, over time, turn into that bit of remembrance, into tradition, into life continuing in new ways. When we remember the dead, we are reminded that love and influence do not end with that heartbeat. The people we have lost continue to shape us, and the values we hold, the stories we tell, and the ways we live our lives. Remembering them invites us to recognize the continuity of life, how even in absence, their presence persists. Impermanence also teaches humility. We are not fixed, unchanging beings. We are that stardust, energy, atoms, borrowed from the universe and returned to it. We belong to the great unfolding, just as the Midnight Mass character said, that drop of water returning to the ocean. One of my favorite lines from that. And when we remember those who came before, whether the ancestors we knew or those who have been long forgotten, we are reminded that we too will one day become part of someone else's remembering. There's comfort in that. I surely find comfort in that we're a part of someone else's remembering. It calls us to live meaningfully now, to love deeply, to leave behind something worth remembering, not because it will last forever, but because it becomes part of that same ongoing current of existence. And isn't that what we strive for together, week after week here at UUSG? In our services, in our outreach, in our daily acts of care, we talk about how to live in a way that matters. As our covenant reminds us, we are desirous of promoting practical goodness in the world. What better legacy could there be than that? To live in such a way that when we return to the earth, we've added a little bit more light, a little bit more compassion to that great web of life. In that way, remembrance and impermanence are not opposites at all. They are companions, one teaching us to let go, the other teaching us to hold on what truly matters. All right, we've talked about death as part of something larger, about remembrance, about connection, but I want to come back now to the act of dying itself. For much of my life, obviously, as I said earlier, death was something distant, abstract, and eventually it became frightening. But through my work in death care, through my growing spiritual understanding, thanks in part to UUSG, I found that looking directly at death, not avoiding it, can transform fear into something closer to reverence. One of the ways I've come to that is by thinking about how we die and what happens to our bodies afterwards. A few months ago, we had the director of Casper Creek Cemetery here at UUSG sharing her thoughts about eco-conscious and natural burial practices. I've also had the privilege in my job to work with several green burial cemeteries across the U.S., places where death is not treated as medical failure to be hidden away, but as a natural process to be embraced. In these spaces, I've watched how death quite literally can return to life within the earth. How a body placed gently in the soil nourishes the land, grass grows thicker, insects and small creatures thrive. It's humbling and beautiful to realize that even in death, we are still participating in the great circle of life. I want to call back to one specific section within that soliloquy for Midnight Mass. This matter, this body, is mostly empty space after all. And solid matter, it's just energy vibrating very slowly. There is no me, there never was. The electrons of my body mingle and dance with the electrons of the ground below me and the air I'm no longer breathing. I am the lightning that jumps between. I am the energy firing the neurons, and I am returning, just by remembering I'm returning home. That imagery captures something I've come to deeply believe, that death is not an erasure, but a transformation. When we choose a more natural death, when our bodies return gently to the soil, it becomes a seamless transition. Our molecules rejoining the web of life we've always been a part of. We give back in the most elemental way possible. And maybe, just maybe, there's peace in that. Knowing that one day, the atoms that make up who we are will feed the trees, nourish the grass, or float in the air for someone else to breathe. I promise I don't mean this as a sales pitch for natural burial, but it sounds pretty darn nice to me. But no matter what each of us believes comes after this life, or what we choose our final disposition option to be, whether it's heaven, reincarnation, mystery, or simply returning to the cosmos, we can at least know this with certainty. The end of our earthly body is not truly an end. Science tells us that matter and energy cannot be destroyed, they only change form. And in that way, we continue, feeding the soil, fueling the air, nourishing the world that follows us. That, to me, feels kind of like eternity. So, what do we do with all this? We practice remembering. We keep reminding each other that life is precious because it does not last. We tell the stories of those who have died, not only to honor them, but to keep their love moving forward with us. We show up to the places that hold memory, cemeteries, sanctuaries, dining room tables, and we speak their names. We also practice releasing. We let go of the illusion that we are separate from each other, from nature, from the great unfolding of life and death. When we release that fear, even for a moment, something shifts. Death feels less like a thief and more like a returning. For me, I hold on to that image from the soliloquy earlier, a drop of water falling into the ocean. The drop was never truly separate. It always belonged. That image has held meaning for me in ways, more ways than one. For many years of my life, I struggled with panic attacks. And the only way I could bring myself out of them was to picture water. Swimming, floating, being a speck suspended in something larger and vast. The feeling of being small, surrounded, carried, it grounded me. Strangely enough, it's now that same image I turn to when a day surrounded by death weighs on me. I return to that thought of being a drop of water back in falling back into the ocean, a reminder that even when I feel lost, afraid, I am still part of something greater that holds me. Maybe that's what this season, with its falling leaves, its candles, its remembrance, is inviting us into, a deeper belonging. A belonging that isn't just about community, but about creation itself as well. The belonging that comes from knowing we are part of something vast, eternal, and beautiful, that in every ending there is continuation. I began by telling you that death was my greatest fear. Today, I can't say I have no fear at all. Of course, I'm still human, still clinging to that little drop that I call me, but I also find peace in remembering that ocean. And so I leave you with this quote by Thich Nhat Hanh, a renowned Buddhist teacher. "Life is brief, like autumn leaves. Death is not an ending, but a returning. And love is the current that carries us all back home." May we cherish the fleeting beauty of the season. May we honor those who came before us. May we remember again and again that we are part of everything, and everything is a part of us. And if the only thing you took from this sermon today is you want to go home and binge watch Midnight Mass, I'll still count that as a small victory. Amen.
Visit us at uusg.org.